Claire, why don't we start off with you telling us a bit about the book?
Okay, so it's a story of a 14-year-old girl who moves from London to Cornwall because her dad thinks a fresh start and a simpler life will be better for her mum's mental health and stop her sister Amy going off the rails. But no one really thinks about Zed herself, and she is really sad to leave her friends behind in London, particularly her best friend, for whom she has quite confusing feelings. And she's also really riddled with anxiety about starting a new school, fitting in down here, and also the house that they've moved into is very isolated. So when things start to go wrong at home and in her local community, she becomes convinced they're under attack from a flock of cormorants.
And where did that idea come from?
Well, initially, the idea came when I was walking the dogs in the woods near where I live. And in fact, the book is set in a fictionalized version of the Foy River. And the little hamlet I live in is called Milltown, but in the book it's called Tremelin. And I was walking along the river one day and I looked down and I saw these two cormorants with their wings, you know, how they dry out their wings. And they were down on the sandbanks and they looked so poised, but also so confident that this was their spot, their landscape. And also really sinister. And I started to think, well, you know, maybe there's a story here. Maybe there's something about shape-shifting witches or something. But I looked up cormorants and I immediately got sort of sucked into all the mythology and all the stories around them. I mean, they have been, that they're in mythology because they're so adaptable. The birds themselves, which have been around since the dinosaurs, they are all over the world, which means they also appear in mythology from Polynesia and Norway and Ireland, but also they're in the Bible where they're called unclean, and they get a pretty bad press in Shakespeare as well, where they're sort of a synonym for voracious, you know, they're always greedy. Milton in Paradise Lost, Satan disguises himself as a cormorant, devising death to them that lived. So I was thinking already about writing a book about a young woman who was really struggling with anxiety, but these cormorants kept kind of edging into the picture saying, you know, if we're good enough for Shakespeare, can't you squeeze us in somewhere? So suddenly it became a book about both.
Okay, well, I think we should have our first reading.
Okay, well, I'll start with chapter 1, introducing Zed, and it's the day that she first discovers or looks around her new home. There was a huge bird glaring down from the roof. It wasn't pale sea green like the metal sculptures on the Liver building near where Nanny Pam lived, but it had the same long neck and the same wings angled like coat hangers. The birds in Liverpool seemed friendly, though. They kept watch over the sea and the city and the football club. But this one was only watching them, and it was black. The colour made all the difference. Zed lifted her phone and took a picture. It turned its head in a series of tiny jerks, like the CCTV cameras at her school. Correction, her old school. She zoomed in on its profile, the hooked beak and snake green eye, the warning flash of yellow on the side of its head. Maybe she'd send it to Bethany if she ever found a signal, with a caption like, "A warm welcome from the locals." She could see her best friend's lopsided smile, that one dimple appearing just below where her freckles stopped. She could see her so clearly, typing her reply whilst twisting a lock of thick, dark hair around her finger, the way she always did when she was focused on her phone, that it was impossible to believe she was over 250 miles away. 250 miles. She was probably doing that now, sitting cross-legged, her elbow resting on her knee, sending endless messages out into space, into the huge blank space between them. Messages that couldn't bridge the gap. Zed walked backwards across the lawn, trying to fit her new home into the screen. It looked better from this side. From the road, it was too close and too wide and seemed cobbled together as if bits kept being added whenever another room was needed. But from the back garden, Tremelin House was big and square and framed by trees. It had 3 large sash windows along the top and 2 on either side of a lead porch with wrought iron posts. Up close, you saw the paint was peeling and the windowsills were beginning to rot. But from a distance, at least, it didn't look quite so run down. Her project was how Dad described it. "I hate it here," Amy was screaming again. They'd opened all the windows to try and get rid of the musty smell, and Amy's voice seemed to bounce off the wide, deep stone steps that led down from the drive. They were perfectly designed for such a purpose, like a Greek amphitheatre. "I promised Luke I'd call him at 6:30. He'll be waiting for me. How can there be no internet? How can there be no phone signal? Why are you doing this to me?" "Right now, the internet is not my priority," said Dad calmly. "Right now, I want to make sure everyone has something to sleep on for the night." But this seemed to wind up Amy even more. "I don't want to sleep here. I don't want to stay in this hellhole. It's the middle of nowhere. You're doing your absolute best to ruin my life." Dad put the vacuum down on the path and stood awkwardly in front of Zed. For a moment, she wondered if he was going to ask her what she thought of it. As if. Instead, he said, "Do you mind taking the bedding up?"
That's lovely. And that's the very first time we meet anybody, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's such a great way of opening, because they're all arriving, and so we meet them one by one. It's very clever. And the Cormorants are right there from
right there
the
in the
go.
first, right there from the get-go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I've got completely obsessed with Cormorants. I actually even went and bought that.
Oh,
Nice, isn't it?
very nice.
So you've started something, I'm afraid. Okay, so these friends that Zed is missing so terribly now that she's been ripped from their bosom, as it were. Do you want to tell us a bit about them and read us the next bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's as is obvious from that first bit, Zed is not called Zed for nothing. She's right at the back of the queue when it comes to any decision making or any considerations really from her family. But there's a moment where she looks back to the conversation she has with her friends in London when she explains to them why she needs to go to Cornwall. And it's important because it explains, although Amy, her sister, is kind of kicking off big time, it explains why Zed doesn't. Beth, Kabir and Caitlin understood. They were shocked and outraged when she told them. They actually saw it from her point of view. "So he's dragging you away just like that without any discussion," said Caitlin. "That really sucks." "What, you're going for good?" Blotches of red appeared on Beth's neck. Zed watched them merge together and lurch towards her cheeks. "Why did they even bother to let Amy sit her exams?" asked Cab. "It's not as if she's done any work or is going to pass any of them. She's too busy hanging out with that bunch of miserable freaks." "Well, I guess they needed some time to get things sorted," replied Zed. And Amy did actually start doing some work, finally. That's why they didn't tell us until now, in case she stopped again. She was so relieved that she told them. So glad she hadn't wimped out and messaged them instead, that she talked way too fast. Apparently they've known since Easter, when we were on a holiday down there. They sleeped off to see the house one afternoon, then sat up all night debating whether it was the right thing to do. Didn't think to talk it over with us, obviously, decided yes, and Dad put in an offer the next day. It's about everyone else except you, isn't it? Said Beth. Zed loved it the way her best friend always got it, straight away, no messing. So, as soon as Amy was done, they wanted to get her away from the evil Luke, and you can see their point, said Caitlin. But Cornwall, it's a bit extreme, isn't it? Wow, said Cab, grinning. She might get a suntan. She might eat a pasty. She might even, he did a drum roll on his lunchbox, put on a pair of shorts. He was always going on about how white and skinny Amy was, and how he'd only ever seen her wearing tight, ripped black jeans, even when she was allegedly in uniform. You know my dad, no half measures. Now that he's accepted redundancy, he wants to change his whole life. It's not really about him or Amy, though. Zed paused and took a deep breath. He's trying really hard to make Mum happy again. She had some really nice holidays down there as a child, and... But do you think she'll actually go? Amy, I mean, said Caitlin. Don't you think she'll, try and run away or something? Yeah, didn't Luke want her to go and live with him in his uncle's caravan anyway, said Cab. He's got big plans for them. Oh, yeah, a life hanging out in a trailer, smoking spliffs and spending his dole on getting their backs tattooed. What about you, said Caitlin. Just say no, it's really simple. They can't make you, Amy won't go, and neither should you. They have to go, said Beth. She locked eyes with Zed, and the other voices faded into white noise. They can't risk disappointing her mum. Not if it's what she wants, not after what happened. What if she tried to do it again and... She didn't need to finish the sentence. Yep, as always. Beth had got it, straight away. No messing.
And this is the thing about this book, that it's got so many layers. There's so much going on. It's positively genre overarching. It's your traditional young adult angst book. You've got the depression and the for both Zed and her mother, though it takes them in different ways. You've got poor old Amy being dragged away from her beloved, even if everybody else thinks that's a good idea, she doesn't. You've got the Cormorants, and then there's a ghost story as well. And I can see why that a number of the reviewers have gone, Gothic, Gothic, Gothic. What do you think about that? Do you think it's a Gothic book?
Well, there are, you're right, lots of other things in it. And I didn't set out to write a gender-defying kind of book. I just wanted to write a compelling story with a nuanced young woman at the heart of it. But it did sort of evolve into a heady mix of, there's baking, because a family of bakers. There is Cornish history. There is quite a lot of stuff about environmental issues as well. But the darker elements, I definitely didn't shy away from. And I suppose Gothic is right, because there is mythology and there are ghosts. And that did take me by surprise, because I've never been drawn to Gothic novels particularly. I haven't read any of the seminal texts. I haven't read Dracula. I haven't read Frankenstein. But I did grow up reading the Brontes. And of course, that's a sort of different version of the Gothic. At the heart of all of those books, there is usually an emotionally highly wrought young woman. There's often some kind of haunting going on in the background, and there's often a real sense of isolation as well. And when I started to write this, I had initially planned to write, as I said earlier, a story about someone struggling with anxiety and fear. But I realized that I could explore that in a kind of contemporary, gritty story with lots of issues that any young adult would understand, whether it's friends or family or mental health. But equally, if I looked at fear through a Gothic lens, then I could use the Cormorants as a kind of adversary, if you like, that was otherworldly. And so I could write a much more interesting story, because I could negotiate that hinterland between the two.
Right, so I think we should have one of the first Gothic bits. So Sophie's going to read for us. And this is the first introduction we get to sorry, I'm trying to speak and find things at the same time. Where am I? Remove spotlight. The boathouse, which is a key venue and location for the book. Okay, so Sophie, over to you.
Oh, I'm hoping I've got this bit right now. We're on page 17.
Should we check?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. The farmer came out of his front door as soon as Zed turned into the drive. He marched right up close to her before saying quickly and very quietly, "You come for this?" He glanced around before pulling a key on a chain from his pocket. "Yes, please," said Zed, stepping backwards. "Not sure as it be the right thing," he muttered. "You give 'em back any time you want. No need to explain." "I'm sure that won't be necessary," she replied. "No one wanted to go anywhere near," he continued, shaking his head. "Been a long time empty." "Yeah, so I hear." "And I really don't like the place," he said, looking at his muddy boots. "Gives me the jitters, something chronic. It's only really for storing stuff, but I do need a boat, and I wondered if you might know where I could get..." "Oh, best not go down there after dark." Zed remembered that Dad had given her an envelope of banknotes. "Oh," she said, reaching into her pocket, "this is for you." He shook his head again, more vigorously this time. "We'll sort it out later, when I know that you're all okay." Zed stood there awkwardly. Cordelia said he needed the money. "Do me a favour instead," he continued, holding out a bag and shaking it. "I got something in here that I don't want. And I know Cordelia wouldn't want it either. Too many memories. But I can't bring myself to chuck it away. Seems disrespectful somehow. And you don't want to disrespect him. Do something with it, will you? Maybe take it to the library?" He stuffed the bag into Zed's hand. "They're into local history and always looking for old photographs and that." "Of course," said Zed, taking it. "What is it?" The farmer wiped his hands on his trousers. "Best leave her in there," he replied gruffly. But Zed had already pulled out an old sepia photograph in a battered wooden frame. It was a bird, like the one she'd seen on the roof, but scrawnier, almost bat-like, if you ignored the long, snaky neck and the nasty-looking beak. "What is it?" said Zed again, holding up the corner of the frame between her thumb and forefinger. The farmer stepped back and shuddered. "It's a cormorant," he whispered. "Now, take it and go."
So I knew if I muted myself, I'd forget to unmute. Thank you, Sophie.
I suddenly realised that I couldn't actually hear myself reading if I had both cans on, so...
Obviously better quality than mine. Okay, Claire.
Yes.
Landscape, Cornwall. Couldn't really have set this anywhere else, could you? How important do you think the landscape is, and your intimate local knowledge of it?
It's pretty crucial, I think. Certainly because, as I said, it was the idea for the novel came when I was in this particular wood where all the things happened to Zed. But also when I started looking into cormorants, I came across some really interesting kind of papers on how cormorants had been treated in Cornwall historically. The most important of which for my story was that in 1910, there was a huge cull, and at County Hall they offered a shilling for every cormorant's head because they assumed it was interfering with the fisherman's catch. And it wasn't until the late 1920s when someone actually bothered to analyse the stomach of the cormorant that they realised there was nothing there that was of kind of marketable value. And actually grey seals were the big threat to the fishermen. But by this stage, 10,000 decapitated cormorants, you know, had sort of, well, they'd been handed in. So that gave me a really good reason for the cormorants to be pretty angry with the humans and to want to get some revenge. So there was that, which meant it had to be Cornwall. But I think also I was really interested in the landscape and the natural world. And this came up a lot last year in lockdown, didn't it? That people realised what an important resource it is for people's mental health. And I was really interested in a young woman coming to a place like Cornwall from a city, so you know, somewhere that was very alien, and having nature on her doorstep, and how to begin with that would be quite intimidating. But part of her journey is learning to respect the landscape and to care for the beaches and what goes into the sea and the birds. And as she gradually learns to live in harmony with them, she also comes to a much more comfortable place with herself, because, you know, caring for these things also teaches her self-care and self-respect. And ultimately she realizes that it's a really wonderful resource for her and her family, and a great place for them all to kind of to cope with the things they're struggling with. And it helps her come to terms, I guess, with her new circumstances and sit at peace with them. Yeah.
Okay, so can we have another reading? Can we have a bit of Cormorant?
Yes. So as we can see from the bit that Sophie just read, there is something very unnerving about these birds, and there is also something that happens down at the boathouse. And it all comes to a head on Zed's birthday. It's her 14th birthday, and her mum and dad buy her a kayak. And she goes down to the river to try it out, and her mum decides to go for a swim as well. And Zed paddles over to the other side of the water, where for the first time she comes face to face with one of these birds, and she kind of hunkers down in the boat and feels very panicky. And she watches the bird fly over the river, land on the slip, and then disappear off into the woods. And a few moments later, her mum gets out of the water and she falls and injures herself quite badly. So they have to get dad to come down. They manage to get the mum back up to the house and call out the doctor. And later on, Zed goes back down to lock up the boathouse. It was dusk when Zed got back down to the river. Although the tide was low, it would come back in overnight and there was nothing to secure the kayak. It would probably float away if she didn't do anything to secure it. And if she didn't get it inside the boathouse, or it could be stolen. Did she have to worry about things like that here? Well, it was still on the bank, so not today, it seemed. There were plenty of other things to worry about. The boat was a long way above water level, as were the muddy skid marks cutting through the green gunge where Mum had fallen. To get the kayak inside the boathouse, she needed to open the double doors at the top of the slip. And it took Zed a moment to work out which of the 3 keys released the rusty padlock. Even when she had inserted the right one, she struggled to rotate it. Her hands were shaking, and she kept glancing into the bushes. She twisted and pulled the key out again and spat on it before pushing it back into the cylinder. That seemed to work, and with a tug, she got the padlock open. Zed hauled back the door on the right, dragging it over the stones, and peered inside. It was hard to see anything in the murky light, but she located an old bolt at floor level, and once she'd released that, she was able to pull back both doors as far as they would go. She put her hands on her hips, but in a moment they were back at her sides, tensed, flexed, and ready. Cordelia had said Kara wanted to make this her home, made it out to be some kind of love nest. Yeah, right. Zed turned and began to edge her way back down the slip until she was level with the bow of the kayak. She reached for the handle and pulled it towards her. It came easily, sliding over the wet grass. Crouching down, she managed to get far enough underneath to ease it over the trench between the bank and the slipway. And then by wriggling it to one side, she was able to lower it with only a small bump onto the stones. She was pulling it up the slip when the first belch in the bushes jolted her forwards. It was echoed immediately by another further away, and then another close by, almost overhead. She knew that sound. She gave the boat a last violent tug onto the flat, and then, as fast as she could, she shoved it through the boathouse doors, along the ground until it came to rest beside the rowing boat. She edged her way back to the entrance, and cowering under the slate overhang, her back pressed up against the doorframe, she peered up into the trees. How many were out there? 3? 4? They were very close. She pulled the first door shut and twisted the bolt from side to side as fast as she could, forcing it into the ground. Once secure, she reached for the second door and was swinging it back towards her when, "Gee!" Zed screamed. She yanked the door, not shut, but enough, and heard a violent thud as the bird hit the wood. It fell to the ground, staggered and slipped. Pumping its wings, straining its neck, it tried to lift itself off the ground again and then stumbled into the bushes, screeching. And then another, diving towards her. A thick black dart coming straight at her, its beak an open compass, shiny and sharp on either side of a gaping black hole. She ducked, hands over her face, and it swerved off to the left at the last minute. Through her fingers, she could see its open beak silhouetted against the sky, a pair of hooked tweezers. Zed yanked the door again as hard as she could, but it was snagging on some loose shingle. She kicked the grit out of the way and pulled the door shut just in time as a third shrieking bird threw itself at her. With such ferocity, it dented the rotting door, pushing the pulpy wood into a bulge that she could feel under her hand as she pressed herself against the inside. She flung herself to the far end of the building, nearly tripping over Dad's outboard motor, and crouched down in the corner by the stove. She could hear them on the roof, their shrill squawks cutting through the dull thuds of their feet and wings. It was getting louder and louder, the thumping blending like the rain had in the storm, that call ripped from deep inside their guts. Then a crash. Shattered glass flung into the room. Zed twisted her neck and tried to squeeze sideways between the boat and the wall, but she couldn't breathe. There were sparks fizzing inside her eyelids, red hot spits on her hand and face. Her throat was tight, her chest was tight. She couldn't get enough air, but then a hit of oxygen and the soft beating of wings like someone shaking out a rug, followed by silence. The cormorants had gone.
That's so atmospheric. And you manage the anxiety really well. I absolutely relate to that sparking thing. That's what I do sometimes. It feels like there's molten lead in my veins and that sort of thing.
I actually watched a lot of vlogs when I was writing those scenes about people actually describing and in some cases almost reliving panic attacks. And because I haven't ever had a panic attack, so I really needed to know what it actually felt like. And they were pretty harrowing, actually, some of them.
Yeah. So, more about the Cormorants. There is somebody in Claremore who is on their side and is very definitely a champion for cormorant kind in particular, but bird kind also. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Denzel, and then we'll ask Sophie to read that section?
Yeah, Denzel. I really loved writing Denzel. He's a very complex young man who chooses to sleep rough in the woods sometimes, and he is obsessed with these birds. He sketches them all the time. He collates all the stories, which is how Zed finds out about all the mythology about the birds, and he kind of imitates them as well, their behavior and their speech. So he is in some ways a bridge between the human world and the world of the birds.
Okay. Sophie, I'm going to bring you in and ask you to read that section.
Sure.
Hang on, just finding my spotlight. Add spotlights. And then remove us. I'm sure there's a quick way of doing this, but I haven't found it yet.
Shh! Keep still. Zed swung around to see a scruffy-looking boy, maybe 16 or 17, with dark hair scraped into a ponytail and a wispy beard. He was sitting on an upturned plastic crate, holding a sketchbook, and had a pile of little lumps of charcoal by his feet. Oh, bollocks! It's gone! Zed turned back towards the water, just in time to see a large black bird take off from the sandbank. I'm so sorry, Zed began. Shut up, will you? The boy was holding his fists up towards his face, jerked a finger to his lips, and pointed at another bird a bit further along the bank. Zed watched it untuck its neck and raise itself up through an S-bend to form one almost straight line from yellow beak to glossy black tail. Then, with a little shudder, its wings unfolded and started to pulse. Huge black wings with 3 layers of feathers, the bottom ones spreading out like a fan. And it was off too, raising itself vertically before flattening out and beating its way across the river. One long black wing angled down to the water, where with every stroke it seemed to brush its grainy reflection. The boy turned back towards her, his eyes full of fury. Zed took a step backwards as he tugged his beard twice and then stood, drew his shoulders up, lifted his elbows behind him and shook his arms out. She wanted to get back up to the path, but the way he was moving was so bizarre that she had to stop and watch. It was a bit like the Tai Chi they'd done at school to celebrate the Chinese New Year. He lifted one arm and then the other, and gently they began to throb, a slow, deep throb that included his neck and torso. He bent one way and the other before straightening up, bringing his elbows back in line with his body and sitting down, but with his spine rigid and his chest pushed forward. He stared out at the water, and gradually his body softened. I didn't mean to disturb you, said Zed nervously. The boy grunted. Were you drawing it? What's it look like? He hissed through gritted teeth. She waited a moment before his jaw relaxed. It's a cormorant, isn't it? He slammed his sketchbook shut, tugged on his beard again, dipped his head, and started muttering under his breath. Okay, time to get out of here. But then the boy inhaled deeply and held out the book. Sorry, he said, so fast that it sounded like a whistle. He flicked her a sideways glance. Of course it's a cormorant. Have a look if you like. Lots of him down here, and now you've shown up. He sighed heavily. Them two won't be back for a bit. Zed hesitated, then stepped towards him. He brandished the book and she took it. I watch 'em all day, standing like that, with their wings outstretched. I see, said Zed, who couldn't think of anything better to say. She was pretty convinced that sticking around wasn't such a great idea. Such handsome birds. You get lots down here, of course. Egrets, redshanks, oyster catchers, and I sketch 'em too, but none are as splendid as the cormorant. Look, there's another. And there was indeed. Another bird standing on a bit of driftwood, not far from where the first two had taken off. Its body was so sleek It looked like it had been painted in jet black oil, with a sheen of metallic purple or green, depending on the way the light fell when it twisted his head. Its eye was definitely green though, a shiny emerald bead. Zed watched the boy lean forward in his seat, elongate his neck, and rotate his neck towards her. Name means Raven of the Sea, he said, and my name's Denzel. He wiped his hand down the front of his shirt and held it out to Zed, half raising himself awkwardly from his low seat. Zed hesitated, then stepped closer, leaned in, and shook it briefly. We've been around since the dinosaurs. He spoke in a scratchy voice now, and used his fingers to lift his eyelids so that he stared at her without blinking, his green eyes uncannily like the birds. You'll find us all over. Wherever there be fish, salt water or fresh, no matter, in sea, river or lake, there's bound to be some kind of cormorant. We don't venture far away from the shore, mind. Then suddenly he snapped out of it. Look, it's drying itself. He pointed at the cormorant. It seemed to tremble for a moment and then spread out its wings. It's a bit like a pelican, said Zed. Folks say they be related, he replied. I'm guessing it's the big bill. Then off he went, speaking really fast and every now and again jabbing the air with his finger. Folks have a lot to say about these birds, always have. They're supposed to signify nobility and good luck, especially when there be three flying together, but more often they get bad press. And I know what that feels like. That's why I like 'em. What do you mean, bad press? How long have you got? But he didn't wait for an answer. Okay, let's start with the Bible. They're mentioned 4 times in the Old Testament: Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Zephaniah, and each time they're ranked with the unclean. Yet, I know what that feels like too, he said, sniffing at his armpit. Zed laughed. Then Shakespeare uses the word cormorant as a synonym for voracious. Ah, said Zed. He looked at her and rolled his eyes. It means greedy. Yeah, I knew that, she said, a bit too quickly. Well, takes one to know one, I guess, but we're much greedier than them, so much greedier. And it's not just Shakespeare who's at it. In Paradise Lost, Milton says Satan breaks into paradise and sits on the tree of life like a cormorant, devising death to them that lived. Well, you can't get much more damning than that, can you? No, I guess not. So, like I say, a bad press. Maybe it's because they look so creepy. His eyes narrowed. He dipped his head again, and his hands balled up. But he shook them out almost immediately, tugged his beard and said, Others get it, though, in stories. That there's more to them, I mean. You go to school, right? Yeah, obviously. Well, when I did, which wasn't very often, so actually it's not obvious, smart arse, we did Greek mythology, and that was actually quite cool. I managed 3 days on the trot when we did the Odyssey. Did you do that? Maybe, said Zed, who had vague memories of a primary school teacher bringing in a donkey pinata to illustrate the story of the Trojan horse. Then you'll remember the sea nymph disguising herself as a cormorant and helping Odysseus stay afloat after a storm. No, not ringing any bells. Well, that sounds a bit more helpful, said Zed. Well, that's just it. They can be helpful if you know how to engage with them. And it's not just the Greeks that knew that, it's the Chinese, the Polynesians. And there'd be loads of stuff in Norwegian folklore too. Zed was still thinking about Beth smashing up the donkey and giving her all the jelly beans because they were her favourite. And yeah, you don't want them as your enemy. If you're set against them, you're screwed. But all the stories of messages from the dead and the like, it depends how you take it, doesn't it? Zed nodded. Right, well, I'd better be going. In Ireland, they say once sitting on a church steeple is a warning that there's danger ahead. But I'd rather know, wouldn't you? It's helpful, like you say, you can prepare. And there were lots of stories about bringing fishermen luck. Yeah, well, and it's true, you know. A fisherman from Oslo who used to work down Newlyn way once told me his people knew those who died at sea visited their old homes in the form of a cormorant. And he wasn't just talking stories. His best friend died out on the lifeboat, and he saw him every day sitting on a buoy in the harbour, looking out for them all. I'm going to head off now. Oh, they be intelligent birds, all right, adaptable, and they don't forget. Them birds don't forget a thing. Something shifted in his eyes. The shoulders hunched up again, the elbows pushed out behind, the hands splayed. And then he was back, all human, just a boy talking to a girl in a wood. Where you be from then? He asked, turning to face her for the first time. We've just moved into Tremelin House. He grunted. Don't go that way myself. Not these days. Zed realised she was still holding his sketchbook. Can I see your drawings? Gave them to you, didn't I? He shrunk into his coat and yanked his beard. There was nowhere for her to sit, so wedging her foot against a tree trunk, she leaned the book on her thigh, opened it carefully, and turned over the pages one by one. Those are herons just up from here, and that's the yellow flag iris, said Denzel. You'd have seen that, I suppose. Ah, but not the bluebells. They were out in May. And you've missed the wild garlic. The whole wood stank of it. Wonderful to eat, mind. I picked sacks of the stuff. Ah, there you go. The cormorants. And there were pages and pages of them. A few in pencil, but mainly charcoal. Some were just simple 2 or 3 lines capturing the bird in flight, the soft curves of its breast and neck, and others were more detailed. And then there was writing too, little hunched up spiky words with sketches all over the margins, jabbing and swooping round the text. See, I've written down some of the stories too, he pointed. Zed turned to a couple of watercolours, loosely inserted into the book. The first was of a nest with 3 pale blue eggs, and the next was all about the splash, the frothy whites and dabs of blue sitting above the sleek black torpedo of the bird, easing its way through the water. Do they dive for fish then? She asked. They don't dive, you tuss, they swim. In fact, we can swim better than a fish, he said proudly, and he was up on his feet, his arms above his head, hands pressed together like an arrow. We can dive down, I'll give you that, a long, long way, but we use our wings and feet to chase and twist and turn. That's swimming in my book, and it's as elegant as a ballerina. He stopped abruptly and looked at Zed, slouching in her jeans and her trainers. Don't suppose you be a dancer then? She stood up straight. I could if I... But he didn't let her finish. It's hard to catch a likeness when they're moving, but most often, if they're not disturbed, he said pointedly, they're still enough. I said I was sorry. Mind you, the other night they were acting so teasy. He hopped from one foot to the other, twisting his body as if he was in pain. Do you remember the night when it was prison down? They were screeching and squawking and pecking at each other, leaving feathers all over the path, actually drawing blood, like something had addled their brains, he said, frowning. I can believe it, said Zed, who found his reenactment unsettling enough. I left him to it. I often sleep here, under the stars, away from people and all their crap. But not that night. Zed had reached the end of the drawings, and she shut the book.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sophie. I have to say, I am, apart from Sophie, the only person who's listened to the whole of the audiobook. And I was listened to it from duty, you know, because I had to make sure that there weren't any mistakes, and I was just completely sucked in, and I couldn't stop listening. And I was finding new things in it from Sophie's reading of it. It's absolutely brilliant. Highly recommend it.
Well, I have to say, Cherry, that it's the writing, obviously, you know, it comes off the page, and the characters are so fantastic. It was an absolute joy to read. I do a lot of audiobooks, and this was a really, really fabulous one to read.
Yeah, I really felt we tested you with Denzel, all those statters, and I was thinking this will be interesting, and it's just spot on, absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, it's wonderful to hear it for the first time. Yeah, absolutely wonderful. I'm thrilled. Thank you, Sophie.
Oh, thank you, Claire. I didn't realise you hadn't heard.
No, I've heard it. No,
I've heard the opening chapter. No, but that's it, and it is wonderful to see it. It's very strange because, you know, I wrote it quite a long time ago now, and particularly with the year that we've had, obviously with lockdown, it being delayed for a year. So I'm looking at it not from a writing point of view. I'm just listening. It's lovely.
Oh, great. Good. Well, I'm so glad I've done him justice.
You certainly have.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to turn you off, Sophie. Thank you so much. Actually, and I'm not going to add you yet, Claire. I'm just going to show a couple of the pictures that we were talking about there, because what's unique about this book is that the illustrations are actually Denzel's illustrations. It's not illustrating the story, it's illustrating Denzel's understanding of the world almost. Okay, that's not quite working how it was this morning. I may have to come in and out. How annoying. Okay. Bear with me. I was doing this morning, and there was a nice little button that meant I could move on from one to the next, but it's not working now. Oh, there they are. Why wasn't that showing? I didn't mean to do that quite that fast, but you get the idea. And this is Sally's work, and I'm going to invite Sally and Claire to have a little chat amongst themselves about that sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? About how that worked. Hang on, let's find Sally.
Yeah, what I'd love to show is actually in the book, because it's lovely to see the images like that, but when you see them in the book, you can see they've been ripped out of Denzel's sketchbook, and he kind of thrusts them into Zed's hand, and so the way they're laid out on the page is with this lovely ripped kind of side, which I think even adds more to his sort of jagged, intense, cramped style. So, Cherry, are we taking over here?
You are. Chatting to Sally. Yes.
Over to you. What a pleasure to chat to you, Sally. So when we first gave you this brief, it was a bit of an odd one, wasn't it? Because it wasn't just about illustrating a story, and it was important, I felt, to have one of the myths that Denzel kind of goes on about a lot, one of those myths in its entirety, so that people saw the type of story about the birds. But equally, it was a real insight into the kind of disordered, complex, intense, passionate place that is his brain. So how did you go about approaching it?
Well, with Denzel, I actually love Denzel because he's got such a complex character and he's so unique. But I think I just read about him. I didn't read the book. I just read about Denzel, so I could get an idea of his character and where he sort of sat in his life to relate to the birds and how he sketched. And the way you described him sort of unfurling like a cormorant just gave me such a deep understanding of how he would do the drawings. Almost like he'd be hunched up and it would be jagged, and there would be very much a lot of emotion and a lot of sort of almost a reaction to the birds flying about rather than him sketching, almost like he was intuitively capturing them.
Yeah, and that really comes across in the pictures because he's almost part of that community. There's so much of him on the page with those drawings that his character is there as much as the birds themselves, which is exactly what I wanted. Do you want to tell everyone how you got the writing right? Because I think when you first sent us the pictures, we loved the drawings. The drawings were so wonderful, and what I particularly liked about them was the sketchbook quality. They weren't necessarily finished. Some of them were just a few lines or a bit of charcoal. But what wasn't quite working was the writing, because I think it was your handwriting. It's lovely and round and happy, and so we said to you, no, we need more intensity. So what did you do with that?
Well, it was quite a feat, because I am very neat in my writing and very flowing, and I wanted this jagged. No matter how jagged I wrote with my right hand, it all came across as some nice schoolgirl writing a very pleasant fairy tale. And so I think it was Cherry that said, try with your left hand. And that was the opening of a whole new world, because I'd never actually tried to write properly with my left hand. And the jaggedness, because it's not your preferred way of using for writing or drawing, it just made the words jagged. And every mistake I made, I left in, because it was like it was part of the narrative of him writing that. And you felt that intensity of speed as he wrote, because it was very jagged, very almost unreadable in some ways, because of the way he sort of like skipped the lines across the page. And using and using my left hand, I did get cramp. But it got me into the sort of his mindset. His drawings were jagged. I did those with my right hand, but his writing is jagged as well, and his personality is jagged. So it's very much part and parcel of that sort of angled cormorant type feel that he has with his writing as well, with his drawing. So yeah, the writing was fun.
Well, I hope your hands recovered.
Oh yeah.
Good. I think that's said everything about the drawings. I mean, they speak for themselves, really, don't they? So we don't.
I have to admit that whilst just by being here tonight, I forgot I was part of the panel, because I was just so in-depthly like lost in the words and everything. It's been a wonderful evening with the reading, so thanks for letting me be involved.
Oh, thank you.
That's very kind. I'm going to show the pictures again, because I whisked through them a little bit. So I need to, where are we? There it is. Yes. And as you can see, it really is wonderfully scrunched up and awkward, the writing. I did feel very bad about the cramp, I have to say, because it was my idea, but I particularly like this one. I like the flight of birds across the top. I think that's just beautiful. They are exquisite and so exciting. And this one sitting on the
boathouse.
On the boathouse.
Which is perfect.
Not going there yet. Just shut that down. Okay, now what was I doing next? Oh, questions from the audience. What have we got?
We've got quite a few.
Okay. Let me get Claire on Spotlight, and I'll go away and let you.
Super. So starting at the beginning, Claire, Pippa kicked kicked us off with a question about the title and Zed's name, and you alluded to it earlier, about the way her name does sort of demonstrate something about her, but people were wondering, is it her real name or is Zed a nickname?
No, it is definitely a nickname. She reveals her real name right at the end, which is Zoe. But I didn't actually know her real name until I wrote that last chapter, and I thought, well, I probably should know what she's actually called. Yeah, I mean, actually, it's slightly pretentious. It came from King Lear. It's Kent says, "Thou horse on cur, thou unnecessary letter," and it's an insult. And this idea that she's the last letter of the alphabet, the least important person. And as I said, when everything kicks off at the beginning of the story, that name is so appropriate because she's the one person whose needs have not been taken into consideration, partly because she hasn't really articulated them, but equally just because everybody else has got so much of their own crap going on that she doesn't really get a look in.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's really interesting to hear where you got the idea from. I didn't know that before. And then there've been quite a few questions about various characters. So I'm going to kind of amalgamate them into one or two, really.
Okay.
People saying how much they love Denzel, and then others how much they love Tamsin as a favourite character. A lot of people. But question for you, really. Do you have a favourite character? And also some people wondering, are any of the characters inspired by real life people in your world?
No. I mean, obviously every character is an amalgamation of lots of people that I have known, but no one's specific. I'm not brave enough to just to steal too much and have to justify it. So no, they all just evolved, you know, as I wrote it. I mean, I think it's possibly my kind of acting background that I tend to get to know my characters really well before I start writing, and I, rather than just sort of doing character blogs and all sort of biogs and all that kind of stuff, I do almost have to physically inhabit them. I quite often find bits of clothing or a hat or a pair of shoes or the contents of a handbag or something, just to kind of get into to them and their kind of metabolisms almost. It seems quite important to me. So they just kind of evolved. I mean, I've certainly, Denzel was an interesting one because I don't want to label him. I'm not an expert, and you know, I don't really profess to know enough about people on the autistic spectrum conditions. But I have worked with a few young men who are not that dissimilar to Denzel, and the coping strategies that he develops are similar to some of the ones that these young men I've worked with in higher education. And I did a lot of research. I was quite interested about him making choices, really taking responsibility for caring for himself and making choices, choosing strategies that helped him. So this withdrawal, when he removes himself from you know, town, when he goes to sleep or to be in the woods or be by himself, or when he retreats into almost like a role play of being in the birds, which is, you know, something I've read quite a lot about with pathological demand avoidance, you know, which is another autistic spectrum thing. So there were little bits of all of that, but that also obviously served the narrative because I loved exploring the very disorganized speech patterns, particularly in the way he was quite jerky in all his movements, because it suited him as well to fit that into being like the birds, because he could almost relate to them better than he could humans. So he was really interesting to write. If I had to choose a character that was most fascinating to research and then explore, it was probably Denzel.
Yeah, I think that comes across in the book, definitely. something that comes up when you're talking about the dialogue and the way that Denzel talks. There was a question as well about the dialogue between the teenagers and how you sort of made sure that that was authentic. And because it really does, you know, hearing it read out, it really does sound, you know, like genuine young people talking to each other.
Well, I have got teenagers, so maybe there's an element of that. I mean, what I did learn very quickly is you can't use anything that's too of the moment, because obviously it'll be totally out of date within about 2 weeks. And it's the same as social media platforms. And Cherry was very good at sort of saying, don't use Snapchat, because in a year's time, it won't be, you know, I think I was allowed to mention YouTube once. But I kept it vague often because it would just go so out of date, and that's the same with language as well. So it was about finding a kind of generic rhythm that sounded young, rather than actually a vocabulary that sounded as teenagers would, because, you know, even with the extra year, because of lockdown, it would have been so out of date.
Do you think that dialogue is sort of so essential to the way that you write because of your background in theatre and acting? Because it really, each character has such distinct dialogue in this book.
Yeah, I think that's probably inevitable. You spend so long working with other people's words when you're an actor, and you know that is your raw material for getting to every character. That's all you've got. It's words, really. I mean, the odd stage direction, but basically it's words. And actually, quite often when I write scenes, I will write them almost like a script, and then once I've got the dialogue right, I'll go back in and fill in descriptions and if you like, stage directions, explain what's going on. But I write in the present tense in dialogue, because that's how I hear the voices in my head.
That's a really interesting insight into the way that you write. So you've started to answer this, but there was a question from Catherine Stevens about how sort of long was the writing process of the book, and how did the story evolve over the time that you were writing it?
Well, because I'm trying to fit it in around everything else, quite a long time. I mean, I probably started it, I probably wrote the first draft in about 9 months, and then I kind of parked it and went off and did other things, and then came back and then wrote another draft, and then another draft, and then obviously once Cherry took it on, we then edited it together, so it went through a few more kind of edits, sort of some bigger ones, and then just the kind of close edit. So yeah, a while, and then of course lockdown, and that's another year. So yeah, it's not been. I mean, I hope now that I've got one under my belt. I mean, since I wrote Zed, I've written some interlinked short stories, and I'm kind of halfway, about a third of the way through an adult for novel, a novel for adults. So I'm on a bit more of a roll now, and I'm prioritizing it a bit more. So hopefully the next one will happen quicker. That's the plan anyway.
Okay, there's a couple more if we've got time for them. So this one references a character who we haven't met tonight in the launch. So maybe you could tell us a bit about her first before you answer. But the question is about Zed's relationship with Cordelia. Whether that relationship fills a gap for Zed and sort of reflects on her own relationship with her family. And if you sort of see Zed's relationship with her family as lacking in some way.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things Zed is obviously quite sad is that she's left behind grandparents in London, and she's got a grandmother up in Liverpool as well. Yeah, Cordelia, if I was going to choose another character other than Denzel, it would be Cordelia, because she's so sort of abrupt, and I really enjoyed writing her as well. And she, once again, not necessarily based on anyone in particular, but she has sort of lots of traits of people that I really warm to and like. She doesn't suffer fools, and she just kind of says it how it is and does what she wants, and you can like it or not, it's up to you. But she sees Zed, you know, when nobody else sees her, she really does. She spends time with her, and she recognizes right from the very first meeting when sorry, for those of you who haven't read the book, she's the neighbour that lives across the road and is quite an important part in the plot and in Zed untangling what happened at the boathouse all those years ago. And she right from the start, when she hears kind of Amy yelling and Zed apologises on behalf of her sister and said it's harder for her than it was for me, and Cordelia says nonsense, and she's absolutely right. And so there is just that understanding right from the start. Yeah.
Yeah, she's a fabulous character, I think. And lots of people saying now in the chat, yes, I loved Cordelia especially. One of my favourite characters.
It's lovely to see that so many people have already read it. It's
yeah, lots and lots. Really inspired by hearing you and Sophie reading as well tonight to get the audiobook, which is great.
Oh,
so a couple of final questions. The classic one for all authors, which is what's next, you've touched on. And then one from Tom, which is an interesting one, I think. He said he'd like to get the book for his nieces. Does it have a happy ending, or does he have to manage their expectations? And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, is this Tom England?
Yes.
So yeah, I can't actually remember how old his nieces are, so it does have a happy ending and things are resolved, but obviously along the way there are some quite dark issues. You know, there's references to suicide and miscarriage. I mean, they're kind of obliquely referenced, but they are there, so it's probably not for little ones. And in fact, I've had friends who've read it or bought it for their children and decided to kind of put it on the shelf for a couple of years. So it really depends on how old the kids are, but it all works out in the end, and there's no horrible deaths or anything too scary, really.
And what's next for you? A couple of inquiries about if there's going to be a sequel, which might be a question for Cherry, but
oh well, yeah. That I'd often thought that there might be I don't know if it's a sequel. I think it would probably be a prequel, actually, because one of the characters who is only, she kind of turns up at the end and she's mentioned earlier on, but we don't really know what happened. She obviously grew up in Tremelin and then disappears and comes back. So it's almost like a kind of Heathcliff thing. You don't quite know what happened to her in the interim, and something made her leave. And so, you know, I've got that one kind of playing around in the back of my head, so I might develop that at some point. Yeah, but at the moment I'm writing, as I said earlier, a novel for adults, which is very different. The main protagonist is a man in his 70s who's dying, and it's also written from the point of view of his carer, who's the daughter of Moroccan immigrants who came over to London in the 60s. So it's a very, very different piece of writing. So I think I need at least to get a first draft of that done and dusted. Then I might park that and come back to Tremelin and the Cormorants and see if there's more to be got from that.
Yeah, definitely. And it's such a long time really since you wrote Zed now. Sort of revisiting it now for the publicity must feel like returning to a world that you'd sort of closed off.
Well, it feels like somebody else's book, which is actually rather nice, because when you finish writing something, you can't see the wood for the trees. You don't know what works. You don't know what, you know, what needs to be worked on or needs to be developed further. So you have to kind of put it away a long time anyway. And this feels like I certainly put it away. But now I'm just particularly listening to Sophie reading it. It really feels like somebody else's story. So I can just sit back and enjoy it.
That's lovely. Okay, there's one final question that's just come in from Sarah Sharp saying, who do you personally most relate to in the book? Who sort of is most based on you, or do you empathize with the most?
Oh, I really hope I turn into Cordelia.
Yes, I do.
Because she's fab, and I like her sort of eccentricity. It's interesting. I mean, I was thinking about this. I did a schools event last week and someone asked me something similar. I mean, when I was young, I moved schools and home at about a similar age to Zed, but I had nothing like, I mean, I just went from one town to another. And so I had nothing like the massive shifts that she has. And I wasn't, sort of my needs weren't ignored in the same way that hers are. And I also wasn't riddled with anxiety in the same way that she she is, but I do understand that thing about totally starting again in a new place, and it's a total clean. You can almost reinvent yourself if you want to. So part of Zed's journey is actually where she is down here. She does have enough distance, a little bit, to kind of work out who she is and what she is, and I suppose I can relate to that. But no, Cordelia is what I'm aiming for long term.
Lovely. Thank you, Claire. Those were great answers.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Zed and the Cormorants by Clare Owen. Read by Sophie Aldred.